Presumably, in this meditation, those of you who are not familiar with Joel's teaching about the rose may have lingered on the material values or material appearances of the rose. And those of you who were able to see the rose as a doorway went through that doorway and found you were touching something invisible, ultimately touching the infinite. Now, the way we see a rose, whether with a naked eye or with a spiritual consciousness, is the way we read a Bible. And so today, we want to see if we are reading the Bible correctly. Many of us still read it as if we're talking about characters named Pilate and Jews and Nicodemus and Jesus Christ and John. That isn't the Bible at all. Those are just names. You could take the name Pilate and throw it away and call him Gregory Peck. It wouldn't make any difference. Who was he? What does he represent? What do the members of the Jewish council represent? And then we come to this place now where we can say that the Bible is not about people at all. Oh, they walked the earth, they had forms, they said and did things, but they're not in the Bible for that reason. They are not external people. There's not a character in the Bible that is there for that purpose. Their purpose in the Bible is to show you the multitude of ideas, thoughts, and conditions that exist in your mind. Now take the name of Pilate away. Who was this individual? Pilate was an administrator. Not just an ordinary administrator, but an administrator for Rome, an administrator for all of the material power called Caesar. And where was he an administrator? In the land of the Hebrews, in the land of the intellect. Pilate administrated in the land of the intellect. In you, in your intellect, there is a Pilate. Pilate represents that outer action, that administration in us, which is a tool, which is used. And now, as we begin to read our Bible correctly, we see that Pilate in us is a tool used by both Caesar, world power, and the Jew, the intellect, so that mind and material power conspire to force something in us to act a certain way, so that Pilate in us must make a compromise. And every other character in the Bible is to be seen not as a name, but rather as a mortal power within us, forcing us to do things that turn us away from the divine nature of our being. Oh, there are good characters too who turn us to the divine nature of our being. But every character in the Bible then is no longer to be read as an external person. Some of us have already discarded that old habit anyway. We see Pilate here now in the 19th chapter as a tool or an instrument of two forces, and he cannot make up his mind. He is forced one way and then the other, because he is not anchored in the knowledge of his own identity. All he knows is he gets a paycheck from Rome, and so he has to do what Rome wants. He also knows that the Jews can in some way unhinge him from that job. All they've got to do is to tell Caesar that he's unfaithful to them and to him, and the next thing you know, poor Pilate, who does not know who he is, has to turn around and do things for the Jews that he doesn't want to do. And so you find your inner administrator, that which makes you decide to walk right or left or forward or up or down, the administrator in you which lives today for you and will live tomorrow for you. Who does he answer to? Does he answer to Christ? Does he answer to Caesar? Does he answer to the intellect? Does he answer to the Jew? Does he answer to Rome? Who does he answer to? And if he does not answer to Christ, he's going to compromise. And we can still further clarify whom this administrator should answer to, because the Jew and Pilate, the administrator in Jewry for Rome, and Rome itself, all represent a material world, totally barren of the awareness of the presence of God within. And if our inner administrator is unaware of God within, we're going to make a decision like Pilate, and 6 months later or 6 years later, we're going to be forced into suicide as he was. Or we're going to make a decision like Judas, who acted from somewhat similar motives on a different scale. And he was forced into suicide. But worse than that, these were visible, ostensible suicides. There is that suicide in a man which is not visible. And now in the 19th chapter, some of the highest teachings take place before the crucifixion to show us that man is daily committing suicide. Pilate, in every man, unable to make the right decision because he knows not himself, goes forth and worships at the throne of matter. And not only that, but the intellect goes right along with him. The Jew turns on the Jew. The Jew turns on himself. The intellect turns upon itself and tears itself to pieces. Don't make the mistake that you're looking at characters in a book. You're looking at the thoughts that are in the mind of the world today, in the religions of the world, in the sciences of the world, in the psychology movements of the world, even in metaphysical movements in the world. You're looking at ideas and thoughts and actions and conditions that exist in the world mind. And they're given names like Pilate and Herod and Annas and Caiaphas. You don't see Herod in the Gospel of John at this point. You see Herod only in the other Gospels. Here Pilate makes a decision. In the other Gospels, Pilate turns Jesus Christ back to Herod. He gets rid of this difficult decision when he learns that Jesus is a Galilean. And he has no control in Galilee. Herod does. He also has had a lot of difficulty with Herod, and he thinks by turning Jesus over to Herod, he can patch up his personal difficulties and also be free of making a decision that he thinks he might regret. Why does John not tell us about Herod? The reason he doesn't is very important. And it indicates why John is so trustworthy as a witness. John was absent when Pilate turned Jesus over to Herod. John was sent to get the mother of Jesus. You won't find it in here. You see, he was taken so quickly that his own family knew nothing about it. And only one disciple went with him, John. Only one disciple was inseparable from him, John. And just as Pilate means nothing as a name, neither does John. But the meaning of that inseparability from Jesus will be clear to you as you dwell with that inner self which clarifies all things. It was John to whom the Master said, "Now fetch my mother. Bring her here, that she may watch me die." And it was John who then went, and it was then that Pilate turned Jesus over to Herod. And John, because he wasn't there to witness that, did not report that, but he knew about it. John reported only what he witnessed. And you will discover that the very Spirit of Jesus Christ directs us to John for the truth. But again, not to an external John, but to John in you. And that should clue you into who John in you might be. We'll begin approximately at the 12th or 13th verse of the 19th chapter. The 12th tells us that thenceforth Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar." And so mind is using its pressure against the administrator. Pilate has tried every way he can not to have Jesus crucified. Not because he believes in the Christ, but because he's a coward. He doesn't want blood on his hands. He also hates the Jews. He despises them. He hates to do them a favor. And yet he's forced to do what they tell him. He doesn't want to, and this is the thorn in the side that Paul speaks about. That which I would not do, I do. Why? Because there is a force working through us, making us administrate in a way we do not wish to administrate. And we cannot identify that force. And so we do what we would not do. We sort of file down the edges a little bit here and file the edges down a little bit there, making little concessions until they become great big concessions. And always the concession is we believe in the existence of matter. As we're pushed closer to the crucifixion, we're pushed closer to the decision we must make. Do we drop the belief in matter, or do we let matter crucify us? We're going to have to make that decision. And then we're going to have to keep that decision once we've made it. Pilate is squirming because he has not faced such a decision. He's unaware that such a decision must be made. He does not know what forces are compelling him to act. Everywhere he turns, matter gets him this way and mind gets him the other way. He's in between. Now the Jews won't let him release Jesus Christ. He wants to. He'd like to leave this town and go back home. They say, if you do this, let a man go who is no friend of Caesar. What about you? Are you a friend of Caesar? So that sits him on his weak side again. If he were Christ, he wouldn't have a weak side. If he knew spiritual identity, there would be no weak side. He couldn't be persuaded or influenced. He would be willing to say, because this man is innocent, as far as I'm concerned, he is free. When we stand in our spiritual identity, we can face the torments of the mind or the body. We can accept them as conditions which must pass, but which have no power. When we do not stand in spiritual identity, then the conditions of the world around us swarm in. And they have a sense of power, compelling us to do that which we do not want to do. When Pilate therefore heard them saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called a pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. The administrator brings in Jesus Christ in a place called Gabbatha, the pavement. And this means a pavement of stones. A pavement of stones, and these stones are literal truth. The truth of the sense mind. Jesus Christ will be judged by the truth of the sense mind. That is the pavement called Gabbatha. There will be no spiritual judgment present. The administrator in us judges by the sense mind. And so today's decisions are based upon what our sense mind tells us. And this leads to a false decision. It invariably leads to a decision not based upon truth. And however right it may appear to be, in time it is shown to be wrong. If a decision in your life is made not based upon spiritual truth, even if you have a temporary advantage, you will discover that this is reversed by later incidents. This is the delusion of making decisions with the mind which is sense-bound. The cardiogram says you have a bad heart. That's a sense-bound mental decision. The Spirit of God says, "Be ye perfect as your Father." And so the administrator in us, Pilate says, the cardiogram says, I have a severe heart action. And now the rest of us accepts this, and fear begins to sway us. Decisions are now made, and these decisions are all based not upon spiritual identity, but upon material identity. And so the operation finally comes off, and it's a success, and we're very happy. We think we've done the right thing, but we're still just as far away from our permanent self. The purpose now of these characters is to show us what mistakes we should not make, how to avoid these mistakes, how to come to that sense of self which is the permanent self, which is perfect now as the Father. And there are big decisions to make at this point of the path, because if you haven't decided that you have a permanent self and that you are at all costs going to live in that permanent self, you're going to withdraw and be battered and buffeted on both sides by the material world and the world mind. It's only when you have riveted your goal to living in and as your permanent self, not the changing day by day material self, but the unchanging eternal self, the life self. When that is your goal, you find the administrator in you becomes not a Pilate who ultimately is forced to commit suicide, but the Father who doeth the works. Then you have the divine administrator, the Father within, and grace flows, making perfect decisions, perfect expressions of the divine where you stand. It was the preparation for the Passover, about the 6th hour, He said unto the Jews, Behold your king. There is a secret in the Bible here, which we may have spoken of many times, in which people who have no idea that they represent God in some way are used to utter words of truth. You will find Pilate, though he's unaware of it, in some cases here is a spokesman for the divine word. The words are put in his mouth. He has nothing to say about them. Behold your king. What he's saying is really a taunt, a mockery. And yet he's saying the truth, though he knows it not. His hostility to the Jews is now being revenged. He's taunting them with this appearance. They know this man is not their king, and he knows this man is not their king. But they have seen fit to accuse him of saying he was their king in order to get him crucified. And so he turns this taunt back to them and he says, Behold your king. Matter doesn't want to do what mind is telling us, and it tries to fight mind. He's now in his own way attacking the very mind which is controlling him. Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Now we are given an insight into the human mind. If there was one person on earth that the Jews hated worse than Pilate, it was Caesar. If there was one person they feared, it was Caesar. They hated him, they feared him. Now they say, We have no king but Caesar. Caesar is their oppressor. Listen closely within yourself to those words. We have no king but Caesar. The intellect of man says Caesar is our king. The intellect of man says matter is my king. The oppressor of the Jews was Caesar, and the Jews declare Caesar is their king. The oppressor of man is matter, and man still worships matter. Man worships that which oppresses him and destroys him. Caesar represents the epitome of material power in the world. And there's hardly a man on the earth who doesn't worship material power. What destroys man? Material power. The material power of sin, of disease, of sickness, and of death destroys every man, but that's what he worships. He worships the other side of that coin, the good material power, the health. He worships all of the so-called positive side of material power, and while doing it, it's like asking Caesar for favors. The Jews never got a favor out of Caesar. We think we get favors out of matter. Now this is how, at this point, John is teaching us that we commit suicide. Worshipping matter, seeking matter, striving to attain matter, striving to live comfortably in a material world. This is saying we have no king but Caesar. Where is Caesar today? The man the world feared. A corpse. They were fearing that which would be dead. But they were really fearing that which was dead. The message of Spirit is that matter is dead. Matter is a corpse. And when you seek matter, you're seeking a corpse. Even when you acquire it, you've acquired a corpse. This is how we commit suicide daily. And that is the reason this occurs before the crucifixion. The Talmud of the Jews declares we have no God. We worship no man but God. No man can be our God. And now we have no king but Caesar is turning away from its own Judaic God, showing how the human mind can be perverted and distorted under stress. It has no anchor in itself. And as this mind here says, is forced to declare we have no king but Caesar, which it doesn't mean at all, so do we every day worship at the throne of the material world. Now, if you dwell with this a while, you will see that Caesar represents that which mankind worships and fears. Material power, material possessions, material health, material bodies, material conditions, all that has the capacity to turn and oppress us, we worship. In the 10th decade, only 30-odd years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, there were more Jews hanging on trees from the sacking of Jerusalem than you could count. The entire city was destroyed. The same suicide which took place in the statement, we have no king but Caesar, ultimately led to that oppression. Now, throughout the world, we know that the Jews are noted for their being oppressed. This is true. Do you see the vaster symbolism, though, that the mind, the intellect, is always oppressed by Caesar, material power? That's the decoy the mind follows. The oppression throughout the world of the Jews is a vaster symbol of the oppression of material power over the intellect of man. Just as in the days of Jesus, the Jew and Pilate and Caesar symbolized humanhood in its various levels, so it is today. The world ruling power is still comprised of those facets of intellect and matter which are the suicide of the human race. These are facts that never change. They'll always stare us in the face until we come to spiritual identity, until we stand in the midst of these powers, of the Jew, of Pilate, of Caesar, unmoved as Jesus Christ was. And this is a symbol of standing in the midst of all worldly power, in spiritual identity, knowing that spiritual identity is untouchable, for spiritual identity is the permanent self. Then the intellect, the false sense of world power, will try to manipulate the administrator in you, but the administrator in you will be God, the Father within, unmoved, uninfluenced. And just as Jesus Christ walks through a crucifixion, we walk through the sin, the disease, the death, the bad health, the sickness, the conditions of the worldly mind. The symbolism is very clear because we're reading the Bible now as John wanted us to read it, not with the human mind. It was written from soul to soul. This is the vast panorama which is on every page of the Bible, always with new names. Before the full picture emerges, you are given the strength and the foundation stones so that when you come to the real trial, you know that you have learned how to stand on one fact, that there is no person where you stand. It's easy to say God is all. But what stands on the cross is the false sense of self. And everyone has to come to that place where the false sense of self is put on the cross. There is no person where you stand. The allness of spirit, the allness of God, the allness of divine selfhood is the only you. And these trials and tribulations are all for the purpose of transmuting all that is unlike God out of our system until you are willing to stand on your own divine selfhood as the only self you are. That is your permanent self. As you overcome the feeling of a personal me. As you release the belief in a material me. And before this crucifixion takes place, all of the suffering and torment we go through is because we still worship Caesar. We still worship the material power of the world. We still fear it, and we still try to seek favor from it in some way. I had expected more than a year ago that most of our members in this class would have dropped out. Continuously we emphasized that Christ offers you nothing in this world. Christ isn't trying to offer you a better human world. Christ is saying that when you look at that rose, learn to look through it. Christ is saying when you look at that person, learn to look through that person. See that every object on this earth is a doorway to the invisible spiritual kingdom. Now, this minute, everything you see is a doorway to infinity. You must cross out that which you see and walk through it to that which you do not see. And you must develop the habit, the capacity to walk through the material world around you, to walk through Caesar, to walk directly into the invisible spirit, always. And yet, in spite of the fact that we have repeatedly told you that Christ offers nothing in this world, many haven't turned away. And it may be because it took 8 or 9 years before we could come to face this truth within ourselves. It wasn't done overnight. We had a foundation. And today when we say there is no person, it's still a difficult thing to say, and still a difficult thing to accept, but it's still as necessary as it was the day that Jesus stood upon a cross. He was demonstrating there is no person here. Pilate couldn't crucify the Son of God. Caesar couldn't crucify the Son of God. No Jew could have the Son of God crucified. Neither mind nor matter nor material power can crucify the Son of God. And this is the teaching that you are that Son. That means no germ, no sickness, no disease, no lack or limitation can crucify the Son of God, and you are that Son. And ever you think you're being crucified, you're saying, I am not that Son. I am material being. No one can do to you anything except it be the will of the Father. And it is the will of the Father that you be perfect as your Father. These are the issues behind the forms and the conditions that we now see at this particular point of the Bible. Identity being revealed, and false identity being revealed. Everything coming into sharp focus for those who have made total illumination their only goal. The doorway which is called a rose, the doorway which is called a river, the doorway which is called a mountain, the doorway which is called a fruit or a pear, or an apple, or a tree, or an animal, or a person, that doorway is only the doorway to the invisible that is there. And standing at that doorway always is the invisible Christ saying, I stand at the door. As you look into the doorway of matter and accept the invisible Christ there, you're crucifying matter instead of Christ. And if you look at matter and see matter and accept matter and know only the matter that you see, you're crucifying Christ. If you see a person, you're crucifying Christ. And this must be seen. When we are not accepting Christ, we are crucifying Christ. When the churches of the world believe in the reality of evil, which is material evil, the religions of the world are practicing atheism. They are saying there is matter, it's bad matter. We've got to do something about that. John tells us if God didn't create it, it doesn't exist. God didn't create bad matter. And if we've got to do something about what God didn't create, we're accepting it as being there, created there. That's not worshiping God, that's worshiping Caesar. All belief in evil is turning away from the allness of God and is pure atheism. And it doesn't matter who is the atheist, what religion he runs or doesn't run. If he believes in the existence of evil, he is an atheist. And it is best to face it. We can truthfully say that we have most of our lives been atheists. While thinking we believed in God. But we believe in a God in some form. We didn't believe in God as the only reality of the universe. And that wasn't believing in God, it was believing in our false concept of God. In our skull we had an idea called God, and that's what we worshipped. And so the handful of us who straggled through this and come to the place where we can worship God finally get the message that God that we worship is individual identity. You worship God everywhere you look. for that is the only one who is present. Everywhere you look is God, and you either worship God or crucify God in your mind. Jesus Christ had the fantastic capability of drawing forth two things in this world. First, to reveal divine action, the great, invincible power of the Spirit. And then, having revealed this power is on earth, to reveal the nature of the world mind, so that this world mind, acting through men with names, would turn and crucify its own Savior. We have no king but Caesar. This is the mind of the world, expressing through the Jew, through the intellect, in which man would rather crucify its Savior and worship its tormentor than crucify its tormentor and worship its Savior. This is the choice between matter and spirit. If you choose matter, you crucify the Christ of your own being. If you choose the Christ of your own being, you must then crucify matter. One will be crucified, and you make your choice by who you are. If you are a material being, you have crucified Christ. If you are a spiritual being, you must crucify matter. That is the choice we all face. Many of us are ready. Some of us, it would be premature to expect you to make such a choice. You've had to go through many things before such a choice can be made. You can't make it mentally, because your mental choice would have no power behind it. You'd find you'd have to stumble. The only way you can make it is if you know who you are, if you know certain principles of how to live in that choice. And then you've got to struggle. And if you do not have those principles, and if you do not know who you are, to say I make that choice would be as futile as 5,000 people stepping up to the podium and saying I pledge for Jesus Christ. The words won't mean anything. It won't keep a germ away. It's that conscious awareness of the presence of Christ where the flower appears, where the animal appears, where the person appears, where the tree appears. It's that conscious awareness that you walk, move, and breathe in a spiritual universe. It's the conscious knowledge that all around you is the one living life of God and nothing else. And however difficult that may seem, out of the mouth of babes sometimes we learn that these things that seem so remote from our consciousness at one time or another are not as remote from the consciousness of the young. In this classroom last Wednesday, we had about 20 people. They were students of a high school. Half of them were Chinese, one Japanese, others were American boys and girls. I suppose the age group might have been 15 or 16. They were here with their teacher. They wanted to learn what this was about. And so they said, give us a little talk. And then there was a question and answer period. And the Japanese boy raised his hands and he asked the strangest question I had ever heard. I don't think he'd ever heard this message before. I don't think any of them had, but he said, well, is there only one life then? And I just couldn't believe what I was listening to. We worked 9 years to get across that message, and I don't know what it is was said before, but he just looked at me and that was his question. Is there only one life then? Now, how would a 17-year-old boy who had never heard this message, or any message like this, how would he come to the place of asking, is there one life? And being willing to accept such a thing. Now, if you're Jesus Christ, you're not seeing Pilate and Jews and Caesar. You're living in one life. And one life doesn't turn upon itself. It doesn't crucify itself. It doesn't make itself sick or diseased or destroy itself. If you're living in the one life, you're living in that which is immune to any form of destruction. And therefore anything that appears to you that is unlike the perfect one life reaches you as a temporary condition existing only in a false consciousness. It's just a sign that for the moment you're not in the consciousness of one life. And so you go back into the consciousness of one life and wait for the illusion of such a condition to be dissolved by the Father within. The moment you're in the consciousness of one life, your own identity passes judgment, not Pilate. All judgment is made righteously by the Spirit of your own being through grace, and once more the conditions that beset you are shown to be without power, without substance, without law, without divine ordination. I and the Father are one life. No person stands where you are. The Spirit of God is there. The Christ is there. The light of God is there. The life of God is there. The perfection of God is there. What is this physical person? It's a cosmic collage of many different ideas and thoughts in the world mind, which we now crystallize into the appearance called form. This, says the mother, is my baby. And this is my baby grown up now to young manhood. There's no mother there, and there's no man grown up to young manhood. There is the invisible Spirit of God. Who says so? God says so. God is not the father of a growing human child. You find many of those under tombstones. God has no human children. God is not the father of persons. God is no respecter of persons. It's time to take God's word, and not the word of the intellect or of Caesar or of Pilate. Now you're fighting for possession of your mind. Either it's possessed or you possess it. Either it's dominated or you dominate. Possession of your mind means you must stand at these opposing forces of reality and unreality. The tree of life, the Spirit. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the false belief in good matter and bad matter. Where you stand and how you stand determines which dominates you and which you dominate. And if your mind is not your own possession, it is possessed. And you will go out worshiping Caesar even unaware that that is what you are doing. Now, at this point, that issue has been clarified sufficiently so that what follows will only confirm what we have discussed. And it is necessary for you to find that confirmation in the Bible. see that Spirit is leading you to not the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, but the crucifixion of your false sense of human selfhood. John, walking with Jesus through the trials, through the crucifixion, is a sign that he has attained in this world the crucifixion of the false sense of self. Jesus demonstrates it, John records it. They're working as one team. John is the only Son of God on earth when Jesus walks off the earth. And John represents your soul. Jesus represents your spirit. As spirit steps out of the belief in form, spirit can only communicate through your soul. Jesus communicates to the world through John. Christ communicates through your soul. You'll find the age of John is the next age we're going to live through. We've had the age of Jesus Christ, and it will continue, but now there will be a magnification of the work of John. John represents the soul of mankind, the universal soul of man. And unless you find John in you, you continue to live in Pilate in you. John is now designated by Jesus as the Son of God. Jesus calls his mother and says, "There is your son." To John, "And there is your mother." And we are told that everyone who comes to Christ is the son of Mary. Whoever comes to Christ is the son of Mary. She has no human sons. "There is your son," pointing to John. But John isn't her physical son. She didn't bear him in the womb. He is her son because he has accepted the Christ. He has crucified the personal sense of John. He is unselfed. To Peter, who had quibbled something about John, the Master said, "What is it to you if I would have him tarry a while here?" This tarrying is John remaining on this earth when Jesus goes off the earth. For John is the only one who can receive the voice. John is the symbol of your soul, which receives the voice. So the Gospel of John is the gospel of your soul. Salvation is not through faith in a person made into a god. Salvation is not through faith at all. Salvation is through spiritual identity, accepted. And the instrument through which you accept spiritual identity is John, your soul. Your soul takes you above the Jew. John takes you to the place where your soul, receiving the light of the world, removes you from the darkness of matter. Otherwise the light is in the world, and the darkness receiveth it not. The whole Gospel of John is the gospel of your soul, just as Revelation is the gospel of your soul. And living revelation is the inner self speaking to you through your soul. Then you transcend the mind. Then you come into the unconditioned mind of reality. Then you live in your permanent self, and you're led into the body that is imperishable. Now these are some of the highlights of this chapter. We'll look at a few more of them. I think we can stay with us a while yet. Important to note is that the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Now this is still true today. We are told that religion still believes in matter and material power. We are told that religions today are worshiping Baal. That religions today are not going to lead us to individual spiritual selfhood. They are preaching faith is the way to salvation. And it isn't. Only your spiritual self is salvation. There's no permanent self achieved after death. The permanent self must be achieved before death, in consciousness, and lived in. Then delivered he him, therefore, unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. And so Pilate succumbs. The administrator in us yields to the world mind, the material powers of the world, and the individual mind of us is forced to make this action. Then delivered he him, and so we're delivering now Jesus, we're delivering Christ, unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. They, the Jews, led him away. The Jew being intellect. Intellect leads the Christ. It's turned around. When we know the truth, Christ leads us. We do not lead the Christ. But you see, this is a report of the condition of the world. Intellect is leading the Christ. It is turned around. That's the meaning of repent. We're turned around, and so we must turn around again. Turn around. Don't lead the Christ like the Jews led the Christ here, but turn around and let the Christ lead you. You see, that means there's no personal self where you are. If there's a personal you, you're always leading the Christ. You've got to take care of that personal self. Instead of letting Christ live itself as you. I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life, says Paul. He's not leading the Christ. Christ is leading Paul. Because there is no Paul, there is only Christ. There is no personal self. Now, how do you face such a situation? No personal self. Go back to the rose. It's a doorway. The rose you see today is gone tomorrow. It's dead. The person you see today is gone tomorrow. He's dead. What are you going to do? Wait for that to happen? Go through the doorway. Sure, it's a beautiful rose. It won't be less beautiful because you say Spirit is standing there, not a rose. And sure, that's a nice person to have around. But that person will still be standing around. Go through the person. Find the permanent self that is there. So to the Spirit. Recognize. Live by. Acknowledge in all thy ways the invisible Spirit. Until there's something in you that is rising, the capacity to acknowledge the invisible Spirit. John in you is rising. The soul is rising. Until the soul of the world is risen. Until we recognize the invisible spiritual universe around us. Now, we must walk through that rose. We must walk through that person. We must walk through every Pilate, through every power, through every condition. And as you develop and train yourself through this discipline of walking through the material appearance and condition and the material person, by not doing so, you keep crucifying you, who are the Christ. With Pilate, it's 6 years between his crucifixion of himself and his final suicide. With us, it might be 20 or 30, but it's inevitable. If you crucify you, that finally appears in the visible as your death. And if you don't crucify you, you find you are deathless. And what appears as your death is no more a death of you than it was a death of Jesus Christ. The death of you is simply an appearance. If you learn to crucify the you that isn't and live in the you that is, the self that is perfect now as the Father. Now this is where the difficult discipline is a daily thing. It isn't something you hear in a class. You practice it with every bug you see, with every insect, with every flea, with every newspaper headline, with loved ones and hated ones. You practice it with the fellow who takes your money behind the teller's cage at the bank. You practice it with the butcher and the baker. You practice it with that which stands on your plate for you to eat today. You look through it to the invisible. And then you stand in front of the mirror and you look through that image and declare yourself to be the invisible self. That invisible self in you starts to talk to you. Yes, I am you. I am come. I am here. I am your spiritual self. I am real. I exist. I am the self of you, and I can walk through the fire. There must be that continuous, daily reconciliation to self, that daily redeeming of the appearance, that wrestling with the material condition, until you're blessed by self-identity realized, until you know that the one that is the Spirit of God, I really am. Then Christ in you is no longer crucified. And all of the hardship of doing this is rewarded. The easy path is not to do it and think you're getting all of the beautiful rewards the other way, and to suddenly find they're taken away. It is harder to do this than not to do it. And only the belief in the ultimate truth of it will make a person do it. He, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called a place of skull, called in the Hebrew Golgotha. There's the skull. To bear your own cross is the sign of your guilt. That was the custom. You had to bear your cross. Actually, it was a cross beam. You didn't bear the whole cross. They already had the stakes planted in Golgotha. This is the transverse cross beam. And you bear it because the Jews wanted the world to know that Jesus was guilty. That's why they wanted him to bear the cross, which was a Roman custom. Even crucifixion was a Roman custom. They could have had him stoned, but that wouldn't have been severe enough. But you see, this is a boomerang. Because now what you see called Jesus suffering, this is the method whereby we are given insight into the consciousness of the world. The mind wanted Jesus to appear to be guilty. He had to bear his cross. The boomerang is that this is precisely the Christ method of revealing to us the nature of the world consciousness. And this is the world consciousness which is guilty. This is telling us that what is guilty here, what is really bearing the cross, is the world consciousness. And then to underline that, they go to a place which is known as a skull. If you think Jesus was crucified on a tree, you're mistaken. All that was crucified happened in that skull. The skull of man is where Jesus was crucified. That skull is the empty world consciousness, empty of spiritual awareness. That skull represents the nature of the consciousness that crucifies Christ in us every day. That skull is barren. That skull is hollow. And even though we think we have five senses, and we trust these five senses, one day we find it's only a skull. It only seemed to have intelligence. It never had. The only intelligence in a skull is false intelligence. Golgotha is where we crucify ourselves. That is where the skull or the world consciousness, which is hollow, barren, empty of truth, buries us every day. That's the meaning of the skull. That's where the religions of the world are worshiping today, in the skull, in the outer ceremonies, in the words, in the concepts, in the beliefs. But the Church of God is Christ in you. Identity, not a skull. The intellect buries truth in its skull. It worships that truth in its skull, and ultimately it is too late. All that's left is that skull. Do you see the vast hypnotism of the human mind that is intended by having the Christ appear to be crucified in a place called Golgotha, the skull? That's why it is Golgotha, the skull. And this crucifixion today is the same. The skull of science, the skull of religion, the skull of psychology, the skull of government, the skull of personal sense is where we crucify the Christ. We have our 20th century Golgotha on the top of every person's shoulders. Come out of her, says the voice. You are infinite being. You can't live in a skull. You can't be guided. You can't have your administrator in a skull. You are the light of the world. Shine. And so person, which is nothing more than the creation of that which happens in a skull, person is the effect or product of the activity in the skull. Just as the skull rules us and creates the illusion of person, so do we impersonalize and step out of the skull. We transcend the skull, the mind, the barren, hollow vehicle which is not a vehicle for the Spirit of God. And we stand outside of that body, outside of that form, outside of that sense of life which says, that's me walking down the street, that's me going to the office, that's me getting married, that's me having children, that's me having my 50th wedding anniversary. That isn't me at all. The skull wants me to think that. Golgotha wants me to think that, and it's going to crucify me with that belief. No, that's not me. Son of God is never going to have a 50th wedding anniversary. Son of God had his 50th wedding anniversary 5 trillion years ago. Son of God is forever. Son of God has ever been alive, ever will be. Don't settle for 50 years when the Father says you are eternal. Don't settle for life that began yesterday when the Father says you are as old as I am, you have ever been. You are my life without beginning or end. And so we're getting out of the skull. We came through a fish, we came through a lizard, we came through apes, we're coming through a skull. We're coming out of the belief that we are mortal. We're accepting the Father's statement that mortality is never the child of God, and we are crucifying mortality. With spiritual awareness. Let's be still for a moment before our intermission. I'd like you to take it as a personal task for yourself to wrestle with the truth that where you are there is no person. I don't expect you to like me for it. And I expect you to have many problems with that task. I expect you to stumble and hurt your knees many times. But I hope you will remember that that is your problem. That is your real task. And if from within you receive the assurance that this is so, and as you course through the Bible and your books you find more assurance that this is so, you will find that again and again, as you stray from that task, finding new problems or a repetition of old ones, new fears, new lacks, new doubts, it will always be because you have not come to that agreement with yourself that there is no person where you stay. You're being fooled by the drama in time and space, the world broadcast called person, the image, which is nothing but a replay in time of all that you already are. And every time you forget this, or succeed momentarily and think now you can forget it, you will make another mistake. There has to come a time when Christ in you is no longer crucified. Then you're perfect as your Father. Then you're the one realized. The Father won't accept any less. You may as well face it. That's the cross we all must bear individually. The cross of personal sense must be crossed out. If you're having trouble, let the soul of you, the John consciousness, receive of the Father for you. Rest in your soul above your mind. Wait upon the Word. The infinite power of love itself will always translate to the momentary need of one who says there is no person here but the life of the Father, and rests in the soul awaiting the expression of that life where you stand. Each daily task that you look through as a doorway to Christ enables you to reach the pinnacle. It's hard work, but it's divine work. And ultimately it's much easier than laboring for the meat that perishes. We can take our little interlude now. See you in about 5 or 6 minutes. I think someone gave me some good advice a moment ago. They said, just give us a little something now, not too much, because what we've got is just fine. And I thought about that, and I agree. And so this is that little something. We're going to skip in order to do that, only momentarily, because whatever I skip, I'll come back to it another time. In the 27th verse, Jesus says to John, "Behold thy mother." In the 26th verse, he says to Mary, "Woman, behold thy son." Now actually, it's very probable that this gospel was written about 65 years after it happened. John had written some things earlier. It was called a Jerusalem Gospel, but the way this final gospel ended up is written by the mature John, who already had transcended all humanhood. There are some omissions here which are intentional. Now John knew who came with Mary. He knew that Mary had been summoned by him at the will of Christ Jesus to come to the crucifixion. He knew that Mary came with one of her daughters and one of her sons. She brought Ruth, and I think she brought Jude. But he doesn't say that they were here with her, because that wouldn't fit the text of spiritual identity. You'll notice who he does say are here with her in the 25th verse. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. 3 Marys. And all following the spiritual path. He was witnessing spiritual identity only. And when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, it doesn't say he saw his younger brother and his younger sister there. He saw his mother and the disciples standing by, whom he loved. He saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. And the funny thing is that years before that he had said to the same mother, Woman, what have I to do with thee? He had said, I am not your son. And now he points to John and says, John is your son. Isn't this strange? Mary had 8 children. But he says, this one is your son. Even I, Jesus, am not your son. He had said that to her 3 years earlier when he had been at the wedding where water was changed to wine. Woman, what have I to do with thee? Meaning there is no relationship between the I, Spirit of God, and a material woman. And now he is showing her the other side of this, who her real son is. Her real son, in identity realized, is always he who has received the Christ. And John, this is your mother. But they were not mother and son in a human flesh relationship. And so this again is similar to his teaching us to leave mother, brother, father, sister for my sake. He is renouncing all human relationships and announcing the era of spiritual relationships. And he is telling the world that John is the Son of God. John is the real Son of God. Oh yes, Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But Jesus Christ now is leaving as an appearance in the minds of men. Who's left on earth who is the Son of God? To whom shall we look? Shall we look to Jesus Christ? No, he says, look to John. I go not away, the Comforter will not come to you. How will you receive the Comforter? You will receive the Comforter through John. Now let's see what he meant by that. Let's retrace several steps and pin this one real tight so we understand it. Now you'll remember in John 13:23, now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Leaning on his bosom. You may remember that when we discussed that, we pointed out this was not a physical fact that he was reporting. This was a spiritual truth being revealed. And now we have it sequel. Leaning on his bosom, we go right back to John 1:8, way at the beginning of the Gospel. That's 1:18. For a moment I thought I missed it, but we have it. 1:18. No man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father. He hath declared him. To understand God, you must be in Christ. Christ is said to be in the bosom of the Father. John is said to be on the bosom of Christ. And so there's your sequence. God the Father, to Christ, which is God the Son, to John, which is God the soul, from the infinite Father to the infinite Son, through the soul to you. John leaning on the bosom of Jesus, who is in the bosom of the Father. This is the direct chain of command. Oneness is attained then through the realization of God, knowing God aright, through Christ in you, which you receive through your soul faculty. And this is why Jesus says, Son, there is your mother, and mother, there is your son. The world is to receive its Christ initiation through its soul faculty. The new age of the soul is the entrance to the fifth world. Now there's one more detail, and I've got to go to it. It just seems important right now. On the cross, where they divide his garments in four, and the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made four parts. To every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. Now you won't find that coat in two of the other Gospels. But John has it there for a purpose. Now his garments are divided into four. And this is the revelation that we are in the fourth world. This is the fourth day of Genesis. This is the fourth level of consciousness. The total truth, the garments of Christ are the fullness of the Word. And when they are divided into four parts, you are being told that you are, as a human being, in the fourth level of consciousness. The fullness of the Word is broken down, and we have had four worlds. This is the fourth. John, just a moment later, is designated as the Son because John is the entrance. The soul is the entrance to the fifth world. And that is why John included the coat. Now the garments that are divided are the outer garments. Presumably the sandals. He wore a turban, although people don't usually see a picture of Jesus with a turban. The girdle and the cloak, the four outer garments. The four outer garments are divided. But there's an inner garment. That's the tunic. And this, the soldiers say, we will not divide this garment. We'll draw lots to see who will have it, who will own it. This is predicted in the Psalms, the 22nd Psalm. But you see, no garments of Jesus can remain because no matter can remain. Just as the physical form must go, so must all that is material go, to show us this is a spiritual being. This is spiritual identity. And as these four garments are divided, indicating we are in the fourth level of consciousness, so it is that throughout the four corners of this earth, in the four elements that comprise this earth, the truth is divided everywhere. And there is no truth in division. There is only truth in wholeness. And so we must look to soul to lead us into the next body, which is the body of the soul. And that will only lead you to another body, which is the body of the spirit, in the sixth world. And that will lead you to still another, to the divine light, which is the body of the seventh, in which you are a complete, full self. But always the body of light, the body of spirit, the body of soul are always present in the now, awaiting your entrance, if you will walk through the doorway of matter. And so John now becomes very significant in all our work. We are told there is an Aquarian age to come. It is the age of John. It is the age of the soul and of the soul universe. It is the dawn of the soul universe in our consciousness, when the garments which were divided are no longer divided, and we are lifted higher into the fifth realm. So maybe that's just a little extra, something that will not take away our conscious awareness of the work we are to do. Other things omitted by John, you'll notice as you compare the other Gospels, and they are because of that period when he was away fetching the mother of Jesus. And whatever he did not witness, he did not report. That doesn't mean these other things didn't happen. It means that he would not report on what he did not witness. In your assignment for next time, I know I'm jumping you around a bit, it seems, but I'd like you to look again at transcending mind and unconditioned mind in the thunder of silence. When you read transcending mind and unconditioned mind, you will see why it is necessary for you to live with the knowledge that only through soul can you become self-aware. Then you won't divide his garments. Now the outer garments were divided, but Scripture said they would cast lots to own the inner garment, and that's how it happened. And the reason is that you can only divide the literal meanings of truth, the outer garments. The inner garment is the imperishable truth which is not affected by the intellect of man. Man's intellect can divide the outer garments, but they cannot divide the inner. That's why John alone could include the inner garment which was indivisible. The inner garment which is indivisible is you, the indivisible oneself. It is never separated in spite of what man's mind may do. In spite of what may appear, your invisible self is indivisible because it is the infinite self. When you have found the inner garment of yourself, which is indivisible, which is the one infinite spirit, then Pilate has no power. Then Caesar through Pilate has no power. Then the intellect through Pilate has no power. The administrator of the world of powers no longer rules. The indivisible garment is individual identity as the living Spirit of God. God, your individual selfhood, realized. That is the inner garment which is indivisible, which is pre-shadowed in the 22nd Psalm. The world around you may be awry. Everything may seem to be shattered. You can't pull things together. Those are the outer garments of the mind. The inner self is always one infinite invisible being. That inner self can never be divided. It is always you. It is imperishable. And your realization of that one is your realization of oneness. Then you're listening through the soul. Now you're having troubles in your human life like everybody else, no matter who you are. They're big ones or small ones. Jesus Christ had a lot of troubles too. But you stand in this invisible self because those troubles are there to make you stand in your invisible self. That's what they're for. They're there so that your invisible self may erase the illusion of them. And only when you're standing in that invisible self are you erasing all of the appearances that beset you. We've only got 2 or 3 more chapters now in the Gospel of John, and just 2 chapters in the realization of oneness. And so we're at the place now where you've got to reach a firm awareness that the invisible self, which could not be divided by the soldiers, by the thoughts of the world, by the thoughts of material power, that invisible self is always inviolate. It is always your infinite identity. And you must learn to live in it, to be it, not to just come to it when you're in trouble. Where you are, there is no person. There is only your inviolate, infinite, indivisible, incredibly wonderful, glorious, divine self. Live in it. Consciously look at Transcending Mind, Unconditioned Mind, chapters 5 and 6, again in Thunder. And we'll have a few surprises next Sunday. We'll end with a meditation. But if you are not there as a person, you cannot meditate as a person. And so just do it that way. You see, it's effortless when there's no person there to do the meditating. Then you're closer to that realm called John, the soul. You're letting Spirit do all the meditating for you. Much love and thank you again.